6th verse of chapter 3. So Mark chapter 2, beginning at verse 13. Our subject is the growing opposition to Jesus. There's comparable passages to Mark 2 and 3 in Matthew chapters 9 and 12 and Luke chapters 5 and 6. And Matthew 9 and 12 shows you that Matthew wasn't necessarily writing chronologically, as the gospel writers didn't always write chronologically. Sometimes they go back and talk about an incident. So that's why it could be held. We can find these same accounts in two very different passages in Matthew. So let's begin with the 13th verse of chapter 2 of Mark. And he went forth again by the seaside, and all the multitude resorted unto him, and he taught them. And as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the receipt of custom, and said unto him, Follow me. And he arose and followed him. And it came to pass that as Jesus sat at meat in his house, many publicans and sinners sat also together with Jesus and his disciples. For there were many, and they followed him. And when the scribes and Pharisees saw him eat with publicans and sinners, they said unto his disciples, How is it that he eateth and drinketh with publicans and sinners? When Jesus heard it, he saith unto them, They that are whole have no need of the physician, but they that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And the disciples of John and of the Pharisees used to fast. And they come and say unto him, Why do the disciples of John and the Pharisees fast, but thy disciples fast not? And Jesus said unto them, Can the children of the bride chamber fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken away from them, and then shall they fast in those days. No man also seweth a piece of new cloth on an old garment, else the new piece that filleth it up taketh away from the old, and the rent is made worse. And no man putteth new wine into old bottles, else the new wine doth burst the bottles, and the wine is spilled, and the bottles will be marred. But new wine must be put into new bottles. And it came to pass that he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, and his disciples began as they went to pluck ears of corn. And the disciples said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? And he said unto them, Have ye never read what David did when he had need and was an hungered, he and they that were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and did eat the showbread, which is not lawful to eat but for the priests, and gave also to them which were with him? And he said unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. And he entered again into the synagogue, and there was a man there which had a withered hand, and they watched him, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. And he saith unto the man which had the withered hand, Stand forth. And he saith unto them, Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days, or to do evil, to save life, or to kill? But they held their peace. And when he had looked round about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he saith unto the man, Stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored whole as the other. And the Pharisees went forth, and straightway took counsel with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. Two themes of contemporary events come across clearly in these gospel accounts. First of all, Jesus was very well known. I hate to use the word popular because it conveys different things in our time. But he was talked about. His healings alone made him well known, and everybody wanted to see Jesus. We find out later that Herod himself wanted to see a miracle of Jesus. He attracted crowds wherever he went. He taught in the synagogues. He taught in homes. He taught informally, as we saw by the Sea of Galilee. and people crowded around Jesus. Second theme is that Jesus was hated by the religious authorities because he was viewed as challenging their tradition and their view of what a good Jew should be. We know that Jesus had really precipitated this opposition. He hadn't gone in and tried to get along with these people or to convince them. As we find out, they were actually very hateful and even murderous individuals. And in fact, at the time, they were known for being corrupt. But they were the only religious establishment that really existed. Well, Jesus had precipitated this, first of all. The first time he even went to Jerusalem during his ministry, he cast the money changers and the merchandisers out of the temple. Then, soon thereafter, at what's often called the unknown feast, Jesus had healed the man by the pool of Bethesda, and they accused him of breaking the Sabbath by telling the man to carry his bed after he was healed. And then they accused him of blasphemy for making himself equal to God. So Jesus very early, even before the call of the disciples by the Sea of Galilee, had really drawn a line in the sand with the religious establishment. So he was not only popular amongst the people, he was hated by the religious establishment from the beginning. And in our last lesson, we noted that the religious leaders had actually traveled from Jerusalem to Galilee to keep an eye on Jesus. They repeated the charge of blasphemy, and a charge that Jesus answered with a miracle. So in this passage, we have a succession of events. We're not given an exact time frame as far as how much time, but probably they happened in fairly rapid succession over the period of probably not more than a few weeks. And we see several elements of this growing opposition to Christ, and the lines definitely already formed. In the first event, Jesus was accused of eating and drinking with sinners. Again, these are things that the Pharisees wouldn't do, therefore they said Jesus shouldn't do them, because they assumed that their view of religion and their view of piety was equal to the law of God. And they always equated it with the law of God. In fact, the Jews viewed the law of God less than their own traditions. And they said their traditions and their rules were kind of a fence around the law. And if you didn't cross their traditions, you'd never get close enough to the law. So their laws were even more sacrosanct because they were more careful even than the law itself about honoring God. So their laws were considered sacrosanct. A second incident here is in verse 18. Jesus did not command his disciples to fast. That was another sign of impiety to them. A third example is going to be in verse 24, when Jesus broke traditional rules of Sabbath keeping. In each case, it's their own rules. And then the last one is in verse 2 of chapter 3, where Jesus healed on the Sabbath day. So let's look at the first of these. The first opposition in this passage was after the call of Levi in verses 13 and 14. Matthew Levi wrote the gospel that bears his name. Matthew refers apparently to his Galilean name. In his gospel, Matthew refers to himself as Matthew, but Mark and Luke refer to him as Levi. So Matthew Levi is the seventh disciple that given by name if we're going chronologically through the Gospels. And it was a remarkable thing that Jesus did when he called Matthew to be a disciple. Matthew was, as Luke calls him, a publican. That is, he was a tax collector. Tax collectors were absolutely reviled by the Jews. They collected taxes for Rome, which was bad enough. And the nationalists obviously hated them, as you would hate any foreign power or its representative that controlled your people. And the other reason they were hated is they were notoriously corrupt and abusive. There were two kinds of publicans. The first kind were collected regular dues. These men were called Gabbai, Gabbai, and they collected a tax of 1/10 on all grain and 1/5 on all wine and fruit. They also collected an income tax and a poll tax on men above the age of 14 and women above the age of 12. Then there were the Moknes, M-O-K-N-E-S. These were the custom house officials, and were specifically told that Matthew was one of these who sat in the customs house. They had a multiplicity of charges, and they could charge you for something arbitrarily. They were the most hated of all tax collectors. They could easily cheat people, and they frequently did. In fact, it's not even clear whether they had established guidelines. It appears from what records we have and accounts of them that they could pretty much arbitrarily say you owe a tax and you had to pay it. They charged taxes on imports and exports, on anything that was sold. They charged taxes for bridges, for roads. There was a harbor tax. There were town dues. At any point, they could stop a traveler and search their belongings and strew them all about. And they could extort money from people at will. And you couldn't resist, because they had the power of the local Roman authorities and soldiers on their side. The customs house officials were regarded like the mafia, and they were considered despicable men who abused their power. A good man would not be a customs house official, in other words, and a good Jew could not be a customs official. They were so dishonest, rabbinical traditions exist of defending lying to them. There was a story that circulated that reflects how they felt about customs house officials. There was a customs house official and a pious man, and they both died. The customs house official had done one good deed in his life, and the pious man had only committed one transgression in his life. And the vision of these two in eternity was of the pious man walking in a garden beside a brook. But the tax collector was stretched out, trying to reach with his tongue to the brook, but unable to. And that's how they viewed these customs house officials. To use a modern expression, they were saying the tax collector was going to burn in hell. That's, in effect, what that image was of and what they considered. So Jesus made one of these tax collectors one of his disciples. Not a good PR move, really, with the Jews. But it does reflect grace, most certainly, and the forgiveness that men can have in God. So then we're presented with Jesus eating and drinking with Matthew and other publicans who were eager to hear Jesus. They would have heard about the miracles too. This is likely in Capernaum. And Matthew had invited guests, and these were almost certainly publicans, because good Jews wouldn't go to Matthew's house. And so you have this whole collection of people that Jews had contempt for, and Jesus, this miracle worker, and his disciples are with these despicable human beings. So the Pharisees said, not to Jesus, but to his disciples, "How is it that he eateth and drinketh with publicans and sinners?" It wasn't an innocent question, it was an accusation. What kind of a man is he that associates with that type of individual? And the Pharisees' attitude towards sinners was complete separation. In fact, the Pharisees believed separation was so important you really had to completely isolate yourself from sinners. In fact, Pharisees considered themselves the separated ones. Any close association with a sinner was considered defilement. And the Pharisees did talk about repentance. But their repentance was rather hollow because their righteousness was a works-based righteousness. What Matthew represented to the Pharisees is someone who was a moral bottom feeder. And it was totally reprehensible to everything about Phariseeism that you would associate with Matthew and his friends. He not only represented Roman tyranny, but he profited by it. To use another modern expression, they might say, hell is too good for a customs official like Matthew. They wouldn't even eat with someone like Matthew. It was defilement. So that what they were suggesting to Jesus' disciples were that Jesus allowed himself to be defiled by his fraternization with immoral men. The answer of Jesus was that those who are whole do not need a physician. Jesus was obviously referring to this in the context of his healing miracles, which by this time were well known and widespread, particularly in Capernaum. He said, a physician goes to the sick, and that's my purpose. Because Jesus came to cure man's sin sickness, he goes to them. And of course, he changes them. He's not defiled by them, but he can change the sinners. So it's a saying that theologically we would say that God's grace goes to the sinner and changes the sinner by the power of God's sovereign grace. Then a second line of opposition we see in verses 15 through 17. The first had accused Jesus of poor ethical decisions in associating with tax collectors. This one had to do with not respecting a religious tradition that was important to the Pharisees. The disciples were not observing a fast. Even John's disciples, John was now in prison, but even John's disciples observed this fast. And Jesus didn't have an objection to fasts per se. He even said later you can fast. But what the Pharisees were doing here is they were doing what they always did, and they were assuming that their forms of piety, which sometimes in and of themselves weren't bad, were sacrosanct, and they equated their forms of piety with the law of God, and they were therefore mandatory. So they made their subjective rules of how you show piety to be absolute rules. Jesus was impious, they said, because he didn't command his disciples to observe a fast, and all good men observe the fasts like they did, is what they were saying. In fact, we had just seen the disciples feasting with Matthew and his friends. So they said, Jesus does not have proper reverence for our religious customs. And as a religious teacher, he should be submitting to what everybody agrees is proper piety. Again, the criticism here was made to the disciples. Jesus was a miracle worker. The Pharisees here may have been a little intimidated by that. Later we see when Jesus asked them a direct question, they refused to answer one way or the other. So, in order to criticize Jesus, they question these fishermen. You see, he says we can deal with fishermen. We're smarter than they are, and they can't one-up us at all because they're just simple fishermen. Well, in his answer, Jesus effectively admitted that there was a certain lack of solemnity in his circle. And he said, though that's how it should be. He adopted the analogy of the wedding. He was the bridegroom. And these were all friends of the bridegroom. And a wedding was an occasion of joy. You shared the joy with the bridegroom. And he said, because I am here, My friends don't fast. My friends are joyous, and they feast. He said it would be absurd to stifle joy at a wedding. And the presence of Jesus, he was saying, was an occasion of joy. He says there in verse 20 that there were going to be days when the bridegroom would be taken away. The expression there for taken away is a very strong one. It implies a sudden loss, a tragic loss. Jesus was not just referring to his atonement there and his death, but the means by which it came about. It was very sudden. And it was by some of these, probably these same individuals. The Pharisees were very much involved on the plot against Jesus. So it was the religious leaders who had already spoken about desiring his death back in Jerusalem, and now they've traveled to Galilee, and some of the representatives are attacking Jesus, that are going to be the driving force eventually that would see the plot against Jesus eventually succeed a few years from now. Then Jesus went quickly to the image of the new cloth and the new wineskins or the new bottles. The new cloth is stiffer than old cloth. So I remember my grandmother would mend clothes a lot. And she'd have her mending supplies, and she'd have cloth that she would use and things for patches and so forth. But what Jesus was saying was, if you patch, put a new piece of cloth on an old piece of garment, the new piece is going to be stiffer, and it's not going to go. So you would use an old piece of cloth to repair an old garment. He says, likewise, you don't put new wine into old bottles, or the old bottles are going to, or the wineskins are going to break, and you're going to lose the wine. You put new wine into new bottles. So Jesus is sort of giving the big picture of his ministry. He wasn't here to patch the old system, and the Pharisees very much represented the old corrupt system that was about to break. He was not putting anything into their old, worn-out wineskins. Jesus had a new religious system, and it was going to look different than what they were trying to mold him into. Jesus was making a new vessel, a new garment. Jesus was establishing a new order of religious life, and he wasn't going to be bound to the old one that the Pharisees so highly regarded. Jesus was introducing joy and purpose. His kingdom was not going to be controlled by the traditions the Pharisees had imposed upon it. Jesus was here. The kingdom was present. There was not going to be fasting. And in fact, the feast time was here. So he challenged them and said, I'm not going to do what you want, because that's not how things are going to be from here on out. Then the third charge against Jesus. It was common to pluck corn, and corn is obviously something that came from North America, what we call corn. Corn in the Bible refers to grain, like wheat. And if you recall threshing, when the grain has a husk on it, and the husk has to be removed, and they did that in different ways. But when you were in the field and you were hungry and you wanted to nibble on something, you could take a ripened stalk of grain and you could rub it between your fingers and then just blow the chaff off, and you could nibble on the grains of wheat. This wasn't a harvest. They were eating, because they were specifically told they were hungry. Well, the Pharisees saw the disciples do this on the Sabbath. Again, the Pharisees were enforcing not the Sabbath, but their own super strict view of what was proper on the Sabbath. It had nothing to do with any biblical requirements you could find in the Old Testament. The Pharisees said to Jesus, "Why are they doing what we don't do and we don't allow on the Sabbath?" Matthew said why they were doing it. They were hungry. And Jesus gets at that issue of eating to satiate hunger in his response. Now, Sabbath breaking was a serious offense. And the question is, whether it was the Sabbath breaking. By the Pharisaical rules it was, but not according to Old Testament law. Jesus had already been criticized for telling a man to carry his bed on the Sabbath. There's nothing in the Old Testament that forbids you to carry something on the Sabbath. The Pharisees are eager to accuse Jesus, but here it's the disciples that are accused of the most serious offense so far, Sabbath breaking. So Jesus had a tactical advantage. He could defend a practice in others and get to the heart of the matter, which was really an attack on him. So Jesus tells them, here's the real question. Is it lawful or is it not lawful? He didn't say, does this abide by your rules or not? He says, is it lawful or is it unlawful? Jesus questions the legitimacy of their rule. And Jesus used an example from King David. If they were going to accuse the disciples of sin, then they were accusing David of sinning. The example of David didn't specifically have to do with the Sabbath. David at one point had gone into the temple when he was hungry. And he took the bread that had been dedicated to God on the table of showbread, and he ate it and he gave it to those with him to eat. Likely he didn't take it directly off the bread that was still on the altar. It had likely been offered and then it was removed. And David went in and took this bread, or perhaps it was bread being prepared to be offered. And it was, you recall, the temple had a lot of little buildings around it, and where they kept things for the priests. And it had already served its purpose. The point Jesus was making was that the ceremonial law even had its limitations of application. If David didn't profane the holy things by eating when hunger made it necessary to, then the disciples eating grain in tiny amounts did not profane the Sabbath. And Matthew records a second response of Jesus, which neither Mark nor Luke do, and I'll read that. It's in Matthew 12, verses 5 through 7. Have ye not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? But I say unto you that in this place is what greater than the temple. But if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. The priests in the temple had to do work on the Sabbath. I mean, of all people, they had to do work on the Sabbath. And Jesus was saying, if you make the rule supreme, and you're only looking at the rule and not the purpose of the rule, then technically the priests are guilty of working on the Sabbath. So Jesus was saying, you've got it backwards. And everybody knew that the priests had to work on the Sabbath in the temple. It was pretty obvious. So Jesus is saying, if your problem is you're making the rule so absolute, you don't see the purpose of the rule. And obviously, the priests working and laboring on the Sabbath was part of the Sabbath. So it's not the rule that is absolute, and you're trying to create a rule that's absolute. Then you're trying to bring in a petty application of that rule and say it's also absolute. So Jesus is, once again, is just saying you're off base on a number of counts. Now, Mark did record something that the other gospel writers did not. Mark says the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, which is really at the heart of the issue. The Sabbath was supposed to help man. It was to be a blessing to man. God is basically on the Sabbath commanding you, don't work one day out of 7. I'm commanding you to take a break. I'm commanding you to take advantage of this blessing of not having to work constantly. God created man to have dominion over the earth, but he said, one day in 7 you have to stop. Because it's ultimately not you that is doing this labor and accomplishing anything, it's ultimately me. So I want you to rest, secure in the fact that your productivity is based upon my blessing. Then all three of the synoptic gospels record this phrase, therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. And the word therefore can be read so that. The principle is that the Sabbath was to be treated as it was intended, a blessing to man. Pharisees had made the Sabbath a chore. It was a chore, and it was also something which made you subject to being under the microscope lest you offend the Pharisees' view of the Sabbath. The Pharisees acted as if man was created to observe rules on the Sabbath, and he would be judged very strictly on those rules. It wasn't a blessing for man. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was created for mankind so that it was necessarily subject to its representative, Jesus Christ. Paul's going to call Jesus the last Adam. Jesus is the representative of man. Hebrews 4:9 refers to Jesus Christ as our Sabbath rest. So the Sabbath is to teach us of Jesus Christ. It's to teach us of His salvation, His grace. In this regard, Matthew also records a statement of Jesus, a citation from Hosea 6:6. I will have mercy and not sacrifice. See, the Sabbath was a merciful gift of God, a gracious gift of God. The Sabbath rest was a type of our salvation in God. Other types of our salvation were the land of Canaan, which was the rest of the promised land. After a life of slavery in Egypt, it was a place of rest. The eternal kingdom is also given to us as a place of our eternal rest. We use that expression of people who have died and awaiting the resurrection. They've achieved their eternal rest. Some Sabbath keeping ignores this greater understanding of the meaning of the Sabbath. Rules should not never be the essence of our Sabbath keeping. And we must not impose our rules of piety on others. So some things that individuals can do, says, I'm going to obey God this way. It's fine. But if it's a personal decision that this is what you're going to do to serve God, such as a form of Sabbath keeping, if it's not in the Bible, it may be legitimate, but you don't have to impose that on others, which is exactly the essence of Phariseeism. They were creating subjective rules of piety and equating it with the law of God. And then it becomes really a form of blasphemy. Then in the opening verses of chapter 3, Jesus applies this principle he had taught. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all give this account immediately after the statement that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. This is the fourth incidence of opposition by the religious leaders. This account clearly shows that Jesus is again in the Sabbath on a synagogue. Jesus knew that they were watching him and waiting for an opportunity to accuse him. And in this instance, he specifically stops before he does the miracle, and he wants to make sure the Pharisees are watching. He even brings them into the event by asking him a question before he performs the miracle. The man is standing, with a withered hand is standing there. A withered hand may have been a deformed hand from birth, or it may have been a long injury that the limb was useless. But he asked them, is it lawful to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath day? In other words, what should we do? They wouldn't say. They wouldn't answer him. So Jesus went ahead with the miracle. Jesus made the Pharisees face the larger question. It wasn't enough to ask if healing was a work. Jesus asked if the law demanded that one do good on the Sabbath or do evil. And Jesus was often saying, this is a good work that I'm doing. I'm healing a man on the Sabbath. Jesus' position was that this is the essence of what the Sabbath is about. It's about the joy of God's salvation and what God has given to man. See, the Pharisees were probably hoping that there was a middle ground. If they had wanted to answer Jesus, they probably would have said, well, this is a good work, but couldn't you do it another day? And we see that same about people who have try to impose their view of the Sabbath rules on others. It says, well, there's nothing wrong with that, but shouldn't you do that another day? You see, the same logic. Well, Matthew gives a statement of Jesus that all men would be merciful to a sheep that fell into a pit on the Sabbath day, and they would help it out. Because a sheep that falls and is injured can die from panic. Sheep are very fragile animals, and if they can die just from panic. So it's not something that could wait until the next day. And Jesus gives this as an example of that you should do good on the Sabbath day. So arguing from the lesser to the greater, Jesus said, because man is more important than an animal, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then Jesus rejected their understanding of the Sabbath, and he gave a principle of Sabbath keeping that said, in effect, this is true Sabbath keeping. And we're told specifically that after he healed on the Sabbath, they conspired to destroy Jesus. Mark said they worked with the Herodians and planned how they might destroy Jesus. The Pharisees hated the Herodians. This is the party of King Herod, the descendant of Herod the Great that had committed the massacre in Bethlehem. Now he's ruling over Galilee. And now the Pharisees are working with the Herodian party, who also represented the power of Rome, but they had a mutual, hoped that the Herodians would have a mutual enemy in Jesus. Later we find out, apparently, maybe Herod wasn't interested because Herod was actually interested in Jesus, wanted to see a miracle of him. He had never met him until the events around the crucifixion. But they conspired with the Herodians, who they hated, in the hopes that Herod would help them destroy Jesus. Jesus kept flushing out his opponents. He had twice initiated conflict in Jerusalem. They were upset about his view of the Sabbath, so he healed a man in the synagogue on the Sabbath, after asking them if it was okay to do good or evil on the Sabbath. The Pharisees kept taking refuge in the sanctity of their tradition, in the sanctity of their religious customs. That was their life. That's all they saw in religion, was the religious tradition. And we see this in, religions that go back hundreds and thousands of years. Some, groups just get so stuck on a tradition, that's the essence. And just going through with what was done hundreds or thousands of years ago is the essence of their religion. Their rejection of Jesus was based on their reliance on forms rather than substance. In reality, we find out that these men were actually murderous, and they were ready to kill Jesus when they perceived him as a legitimate threat to their power. Their lack of faith is evident in their condescending attitude toward Jesus. They failed time and again to establish any fault in Jesus. Instead, their own faults were only made clear. Their response was to conspire to destroy Jesus. These aren't just historical anecdotes about the life of Jesus Christ. These accusations are typical of all opposition to Jesus Christ throughout history. They are typical of opposition to Christians throughout history, and unfortunately increasing in our day. There are always those who wish to impose a false ethic of man's making and to chastise Christianity for not living up to this supposed higher way. So humanists will have their own morality and chastise Christianity for not living up to this greater moral ethic. Socialists will condemn Christianity for not living up to a higher way. Ecumenicists criticize Christians for not getting with the times. Statists will criticize Christianity for what it considers a better way for all humanity. Sexual deviants, they all criticize Christianity as an inferior moral ethic and their own ethic as a higher way. Jesus twice forced the issue with the religious leadership in Jerusalem. The religious leaders' answer was to meet in secret to try to destroy Jesus. When evil is challenged, it will fight savagely. And we're beginning to see this in our day. In many ways, the evil that seemed to be increasing exponentially in our lifetimes is being challenged, and it's fighting back against Christianity with a vengeance. But we're told, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. And that's our confidence. Let's pray. Our most good